Okay, today I'd like to talk about the system dynamics method. In particular, the philosophical aspects of that method, not the mathematical. Next time I'll get into the mathematics and into the computer programming aspects of system dynamics. But today I would like to try to tell you what I regard as the essence of system dynamics as a philosophy for learning about complex systems. And it is a philosophy. I want you to understand that this is going to be a difficult task for me to do. It's kind of like describing the lenses in your eyes, which you never see, you only see through. Modeling philosophies are very much that way. I use the underlying assumptions of my method without much thinking about them, just as a physicist doesn't think too much about the very basis of physics, or the mathematician doesn't really question 2 + 2 = 4. He just goes ahead and uses it. Well, I have this problem too. There are some very deep assumptions in system dynamics. I'm going to try to pull those out today and tell you about them. There are probably some I don't see that you will see as we go through examples of system dynamics models. And so what I'm telling you today is probably not complete. It's the best that I can do as a person who is immersed in this field of modeling. System dynamics is called dynamics because it deals with how systems change over time. That is, there are a number of different modeling schools that can be divided into static or dynamic. Static models try to express something about a system at one point in time. System dynamics is interested in how systems change over time. And so anytime I see a graph of some behavior of a system with time on the horizontal axis, I get excited because that's the kind of a system that a system dynamicist can maybe say something about. Okay. The system part is also an important part of the name, and it's to be interpreted in the way I defined system last time and in the way your readings, such as Laszlo, define system. It's interested in systems as a whole more than in the characteristics of individual elements in the system. It is an attempt to take the systems philosophy as the two readings from last time laid it out and to make it concrete so that you can explore whole system behavior using the computer as a tool to help you do that. Now I'm going to talk about four of what I think are the most important aspects of how system dynamics does that today. And those four aspects are causal linkages, feedback loops, rates and levels, and structural behavioral relationships. You don't have to write all that down because I'm going to go back over each one in some detail. So let me start with causal linkages. You saw last time in the deer model that I started each model by a causal diagram where I just made arrows showing what I thought was connected to what in the system. And that's typically the way a system dynamicist begins thinking about a system. We don't always succeed, but we try in including in our models relationships that we think are truly causal. That is that we can when we make an arrow from one element to another element, we think we can explain the actual mechanism in the real world by which element A causes element B to change, causes. That is, we're trying to get at a mechanism that truly exists, linking those things, so when one thing changes, another thing changes. And you should be able to ask a system dynamicist, what cause do you mean by that arrow? And he should be able to tell you what mechanism he had in mind. In fact, ideally it should be very clear and you shouldn't even need to ask. For example, if we write, as in the deer model, births influence the population. That's not only causal, that's almost definitional. It's so obvious. As soon as a deer is born, it's a member of the deer population, right? And there's a plus sign there, meaning that more births give you more deer. And that should be, ideally, in a system dynamics model, any relationship like that is so causally obvious that you hardly have to question it. They're not always as obvious as that one, but we're trying for that. And let me distinguish that approach from another one which you will see in several kinds of modeling later, which is a correlational approach, in which the elements in the model are not necessarily causal, but are simply correlated. And that means that two elements that are connected in the model vary together in some way, but not necessarily because one causes the other. They simply are associated together. The best way to illustrate that is with an example. The lights down on that just a little. This is a graph taken at one point in time for as many nations in the world as we have data about, of doctors per person, per 100,000 people in the population, versus vegetable calories available in the diet per person per day. In other words, this is a measure of health services per person. This is a measure of food available per person. This is all in the year 1971 for various countries of the world. Here's Russia, the USA, Germany, Brazil, India, just to give you an idea. Now this is just, at the moment, it's a scatter diagram. It just takes whatever the health services were and plots them against whatever the food was. Now I've drawn a line there which indicates I see some sort of correlation between those. It seems that countries that have low diets, low food, are also low in health services, and countries that are high in one are high in the other, although there's much more scatter on the high end than there is on the low end. Now, you can do a lot of statistical analyses on this kind of a plot. In fact, we will do that later in the course. The question comes, if you want to make a model that has health services and food in it, how do you connect those things? Because here it looks as though they might be connected. Well, one thing you could do is write food is connected with health services. But how do you know you might also, maybe the arrow should go the other way. Maybe health services are connected with food. And in fact, what I would say, and this comes essentially from intuition, is that neither of those things causes the other, that they're correlated, not causally related. And that probably, if I were going to put those things in a model, I would have something else, like perhaps industrial development or something like that causing both of those things. Therefore, they are linked. Sorry, let me put that up so you can see it. They are linked, but they're not necessarily directly causally linked. They're linked through a third factor. Since they are linked, it's possible to link them in a model directly and say when food goes up, health services go up, or when health services go up, food goes up. That's probably not a false thing to do. But a system dynamicist would try to do it in a causal way, such as that. And that's a hypothesis, of course. We'd have to go on and try to prove it. Just to make that point a little clearer, let me describe to you a model I did make that did have these elements in it. What I was trying to do was to understand how populations grow, and that involves understanding death rates, and that involved, I thought, my hypothesis was, those two factors. And I also made some other scatter plots. In this case, I'm plotting life expectancy on the vertical axis, and in this case, vegetable calories per person per day. Now, this is food per capita on the horizontal axis. And you can see another relationship. It's not a linear relationship, and this is another distinction I should make right now, the distinction between linear and nonlinear relationship. It's clear from this graph that if diet has an influence, a causal influence on life expectancy, it doesn't have a linear influence forever and ever. That is, you give people more food and more food and more food, and their life expectancy keeps on going up in the same proportion. A linear relationship would look like that, or like that, or something. But it would tell you that you keep giving people food and they will keep on having a longer life expectancy. This relationship is clearly nonlinear. It's another nonlinear relationship between health services and life expectancy. And this is common sense. It tells you that if you give people a few doctors and hospitals, their life expectancy will increase very fast. But if you give them more and more and more, eventually you get to the point where, in fact, giving them more has no effect on life expectancy at all anymore. And causally, intuitively, from what you know about the world, that makes sense. Okay. Another thing about the causal relationships included in system dynamics models is that we very often make them nonlinear. We expect them to be nonlinear. We sort of rejoice in nonlinear relationships. We have special ways of representing them. And we go under the assumption that most relationships in a system are, in fact, like this, nonlinear. Now, let me show you how I, in fact, connected these things in a model. Eventually, I want to understand population, and one influence on population is deaths, which is in part a function of population itself. This is people dying per year. And there's some mortality rate, which is the probability of a person dying. And I've assumed that that's a function of food per capita. Oops. More food, less mortality. So that's a minus sign. And health services per capita. More health services, less mortality. Like that. Both of those things are per capita, which means they're divided by population. Feedback loops already. Haven't even come to them yet. They're feedback loops there. Where does food come from? Food per capita comes from food divided by population. Where does food come from? It comes from agricultural investment. More money spent on tractors and fertilizers and so on, more food. There's also land in there, but I'll leave it out for the moment. More food per capita. Health services comes from health expenditures. Let's say dollars per person per year or something like that. And where do those things come from? I would say, let's call it economic output in general. And that comes from industrial capital and labor and a lot of other things. And you can see how easy it is to get into an infinite regress. Let's put labor in, because there's another loop from population. Plus, 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 etc. The model goes on. I just wanted to indicate, I had those graphs, the scatter plots of things versus life expectancy. And this was the causal hypothesis that I drew from the graphs. It's a hypothesis, but this is the way the elements were connected in the model. And if I indicate on here, this is a little illegal when it comes to actual diagramming, where nonlinear relationships would occur. I'll show that by a little squiggle on the arrow. I already said, I showed you some evidence indicating that that's nonlinear and that's nonlinear. Putting in more hospitals won't raise the life expectancy forever. This is also nonlinear because those involve economic allocation processes, and it isn't true that as a population gets richer and richer, it always allocates the same proportion of its riches to agriculture. In fact, it quite definitely doesn't do that. Putting in more fertilizer doesn't give you a linear increase in food. Again, that's a relationship that might saturate. This one's pretty direct math. That's really a definitional relationship. Nonlinearity is there and there too. Well, that gives you an idea of how we begin to find causal relationships and link them together. Now, one other thing I should say about the causal relationships in a system dynamics model, we also, in addition to looking for nonlinearities, we also look for delays. That is, we're aware of the fact that just because you have spent money on agriculture doesn't that fast create more food. It may take some time to develop land, to build an irrigation system, to build the soil up, something of that sort. And so we would, I'll use a little box to indicate a delay on here. We would put a delay in that relationship. The reason that delay is important is that we're interested in the dynamics of the system, how it develops over time. And if we assume that you change something and something else changes instantaneously, and if that isn't true of the real world, then our model is going to have the wrong dynamics in it. Other places where there are definite delays in this model, one is here, and this comes from aging. It's 70-year-olds have a higher probability of death than 5-year-olds. And therefore, when the population is represented in all its age structure, in fact, it takes about 70 years for a new birth to get to a point of high mortality risk. And so there's an inherent delay there. There's a delay here. You put in a hospital and overnight everybody's life expectancy doesn't rise. You have to build up vaccination facilities, and you have to essentially get the population up to a higher standard of health care, and that takes time. Probably a smaller delay, I'll make it a smaller box, in food, because that's probably only a delay of a few months. A malnourished child given food in a few months can fairly clearly recover if it hasn't been a bad case of nourishment. But probably a small delay there. There are other delays, but just to give you an idea, we look for those delays. We look for nonlinear relationships. We try to put them in the, and that's an important distinguishing feature, I think, of system dynamics. Where are there instantaneous relationships? This one is instantaneous because it's a definition. Food per capita is food divided by population. All right? As soon as somebody dies, they're gone from the population, and so on. Now, some of these other relationships might be weak delays, and if the model is a 200-year time horizon, we don't bother with that delay. We can assume that's instantaneous for the purposes of that model. But making a different model, something that was delayed may become undelayed or vice versa. It depends on the time. That's why the time horizon of the model is an important thing to know in advance, because then you know where to put in delays. If we were doing a model of the eating habits of a family over a week, the delay of the amount of time food spends in the refrigerator is probably important, or the time between shopping and buying the food and eating it. But on a 100-year model, you wouldn't bother to put that in. Okay. Now, it has already become apparent to you that I discover feedback loops everywhere I look. Discovered a bunch of them there that I hadn't even intended to put on this graph. I can't resist finding feedback loops. I see them everywhere. That is, again, part of system dynamics. We expect the world to be made up of closed chains of causal relationships. We look for it, therefore we find it, not surprisingly. We probably make them up when they're not there, but we also like to think that the ones we put in are there in the real world. The image of the world that we carry around is not essentially there's an input, there's a big black box where a lot of stuff happens, and then there's an output. That is an image of the world you hear in a lot of political speeches if you kind of listen. It's what I call an open system view of the world, open loop view of the world. You push something and then something comes out. What we look for is a relationship like this. And now I will put up on the board essentially the ultimate feedback loop, the basic feedback loop, which we think every sub-specific case is an example of. And that is, there is something we'll call the state of the system. This is some measurable, visible indication of how the system is, how it's behaving, what condition it's in, what its quality is. And then there are actions or decisions or changes designed to alter the state of the system. Okay? And this is the politician's point of view. I'm going to do a policy and it's going to change things. Okay? I'm going to build roads and it's going to decrease highway congestion. I'm going to build new housing in the cities and it's going to decrease slums. etc. This is the visible part of the system. It's the part where human beings are acting in order to change something. There's also, in our point of view, an invisible part, which says that those actions are taken on the basis of what the state of the system is. There's some information that causes the decision to be what it is. And that completes the feedback loop. And this dual relationship we always are looking for. When somebody says he's going to change the system this way, we look for how the system is then going to feedback and change future decisions, future policies, future actions. Okay, so essentially there's information flowing on that lower link and some visible system change on the upper link. Just to give you an example, picture yourself going to a party Friday night, and in front of you is a keg, okay? And in your hand is an empty glass. Got the picture? Okay. The state of this system is level of beer in the glass, let's say, which at the moment is 0, right? And you take an action which is to turn the spigot on the keg to fill it up, all right? So this is, let's say, openness of spigot. We'll define that in centimeters or something like that. Okay, that's the amount that you have to turn the thing to make it go. And obviously, you open the spigot in order to increase the level of beer in your glass. There's a very important other element, in fact, in that decision. That's your goal, right? So this is desired level. And you know how much you want in the glass, and you know how much is there, and that causes you to change the opening of the spigot. Notice what I just said? Cause. That means your decision, your hand movement through your brain is influenced by the state of the system. And assuming you haven't had too many glasses already, there's not much of a delay in your perception of where the level actually is. And so you do a very good job of controlling that system so that you bring the level of the beer up to the desired level that you want it to be, and then you turn the spigot off. And then this level stops changing. All right? State of the system, decision or action based on that system state. Probably the best thing to do is give you a bunch more examples so that you can start seeing feedback loops all over the world too. By the way, as I go, I should tell you whether they're positive or negative feedback loops. As you open the spigot, what happens to the level of beer? Goes up, right? More open, more beer. As the level of beer goes up, what happens to the position of the spigot? Goes down. So is that loop as a whole positive or negative? It's negative. How do we know it's negative? Well, there are a couple of ways of telling. The mechanical way is to add up mathematically, multiplicatively, all the signs in the loop. And if there's an odd number of negative signs, it's a negative loop. If there's an even number of negative signs, including 0, it's a positive loop. But another way is to just reason your way around the loop. A negative loop is one that counteracts any change. It moves toward a goal, essentially, so that if the level of beer suddenly went down in your glass for some reason, you would take an action to bring it back up again. Okay, so that's a negative loop. Now, let me show you a positive loop. Suppose you have some money in the bank. Okay, so this is your bank balance. This is the amount of dollars you've got in the bank at any one time. And if this is a proper capitalistic bank, interest is added regularly. The more interest is added, the more money you have in the bank. The amount that's added depends on how much is already there, right? There's some fixed interest rate at 5% or 7% or whatever it is per year, 5% or 7% of what is already there. So this is a constant 5%. And the amount of interest in dollars that's added every year depends on how much is in the bank. So the more in the bank, the more gets added. This has, if you will, an even number of negative signs, namely 0. It's a positive loop. And positive loops are self-reinforcing. The more money you have, the more money gets added. The more money gets added, the more money you have. And so on. Okay, so you can think of it as a positive loop because of the way it behaves. Yeah? That's a positive loop. Yes. 2 negative arrows means an even number of positive signs. I'll see if I can find you an example of that and show you. It also will be self-reinforcing. Yeah? I'll get to that later in the period. That's a good question. Let me just give you some complicated examples, because I don't want you to get the impression that loops occur singly. We may pick them out to look at singly, but in fact, almost always we find loops embedded in loops and connected to loops and so on, and then things get a little complicated. I'll just give you one quick example of a multiple loop model, and this is in fact a piece of an energy model that the system dynamics group actually made. Let's say we have oil in the ground in Texas, and we have a certain amount we haven't discovered yet. We'll call it unproven reserves. They're there, we're pretty sure they're there, but we haven't really counted up to see where they are or how much there is there. And then you've got a total amount that was once at least in the ground, total. And those together will define the fraction of reserves remaining. Oops. Sorry. The more reserves you discover, essentially, the less you still have to discover. Okay? That's why that's an... whoops. This has got to be wrong then. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll come back to that one. There's an assumption which really is based on geological evidence that as you draw down the reserve of oil, to get the rest out becomes more expensive. That's because it's deeper, it's in smaller pockets, it's harder to find because you find the easiest, biggest pieces first, and so on. And so as the fraction remaining comes down, the cost of finding more and extracting it goes up. All right? So that has to be a negative relationship. Let's call it the cost of exploration. If the cost of exploration goes up, the price you're going to charge for your oil goes up. Otherwise, you don't make any money. If your price goes up, the revenues coming into the oil company, that's essentially the total money flow coming in, goes up. If the revenues go up, you can invest more in finding more oil. I think if you've listened to the debates this winter on natural gas, you have heard this argument. Let's call it investment in exploration. More revenues makes possible more investment. You've got more money to spend. And if you spend more, you'll discover more. Okay? And if you discover more, the amount you have left to discover goes down, right? Because there's just, you essentially have moved the unproven reserves out into, let's call it a proven reserves, which you then start pumping. That's outside the boundary of this particular model. So if you discover more, there's less to discover, right? Sorry, now I understand why that one was a plus. This is essentially definitional again. The fraction remaining is just the unproven reserves there divided by the total reserves. Okay? So the more total reserves, the less remaining. And the more unproven reserves still there, the more is remaining. that clear? Okay, that's a completed feedback loop. Which is the state of the system? There's a lot of things in this loop now. It's not just two elements like as before. Is there one thing in there that you could define as the thing you would look at to determine where the system is at any time? Could be either this or this, actually, because this is simply derived immediately and mathematically from this. I would say that is. And all the rest is a decision, a number of sequential decisions which tell you how fast your discovery rate is. And the discovery rate is the action that you're changing. What you're trying to do if you're an oil company is move unproven reserves into a proven reserve category. That is, you're trying to find them so that you can start pumping them. Is that a positive loop or a negative loop? Negative, positive, negative, positive. I come out positive. For two reasons. There are two negative signs. That's the quick way. Now let's think it through and see what happens. Suppose you have a whole lot of unproven reserves. Okay, you have hardly begun to explore your oil field. So you've got a lot of reserves remaining. So it's cheap to find more, right? So the price is low and you have very few revenues. And your investment in exploration is almost zero because you have almost no money to spend, so you discover very few. So the unproven reserve rate is hardly changing. Let's do it the other way around, because these loops work both directions. Suppose you have almost no reserves left. The fraction remaining is very low. The cost of exploration is quite high, and so you set your price high, so you get a lot of revenues. And you can invest a lot more in exploration, so you discover more, which brings your unproven reserves down even faster. Okay? So it makes sense conceptually as a positive loop as well. This is exactly the argument, by the way, that you hear in Congress when people are arguing about deregulating oil prices. What they've said is this loop is broken. Congress sets the price, and it isn't set high enough to allow the gas companies to get enough revenues to invest in exploration to find more reserves. Now, I told you that this wasn't the only loop in the system. I see a lot of you look very unsatisfied, and you should, because this isn't all of the system. And one just obvious link that should be in here is here. If it costs more to find the next unit of oil or gas because it's deeper or something like that, then even if you put more money in, you're probably, sorry, it should go up here. You're probably not going to find more. So if the cost of exploration is high, then the amount of gas you find per dollar invested goes down. And so that's a negative sign. And in fact, in here is a little negative loop. The whole big loop is positive. And what that's essentially saying is the gas and oil companies are partly right. If they had more money, they'd discover more oil. But they're also partly wrong. There may not be any more oil to discover there, or it may cost so much more that even if they had more money, they wouldn't find any more oil. At least at some point, the system will probably get there. That is, at some point, this negative loop will dominate the system. We may not be there yet. Yeah?
Well, maybe the price will get so high that people are forced to save oil or find alternatives.
Yeah. There's a lot more to the system than that. And I'm not giving you by any means the whole model. I just wanted to show you how you begin, usually with one loop, then you add to it. The next change I might make would be as the price goes high, people use less. And therefore the demand is less, and therefore, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on. The problem is not where to start almost, it's where to stop. Okay. I would advise you to look back at the causal loop diagrams in the Deere system that I handed out last time and think through which are positive, which are negative, why, does it make sense? And look at how those causal relationships are put together. We'll talk more about the Deere system next time. Just in summary of the points about feedback loops, whenever I hear anybody say, especially politicians, A causes B, I'm always asking myself, how does B come back around to influence A again? It's just ingrained in my system. Another thing that you should think about is that if the world, or any part of the world, is constructed this way, it runs itself. That is, time isn't pushing this system along. Outside events aren't pushing this system along. System is determining itself. In fact, we call system dynamics models state-determined systems. And a state-determined system means that the state variables of the system, the things that tell you the condition of the system, the things that people look at when they make their decisions, are the prime influencers of how the system itself changes. That's a very deep point. That is, if you expect the system to be that way, you look inside it for problems. You don't look outside it. And let me warn you, that is a statement about systems which is probably true for a lot of systems and probably not true for a lot of systems. The ones where it's true, you want to use system dynamics models for, and the ones where it's not true, you don't. And here is involved a great deal of wisdom about looking at a real problem and deciding, does it fit this mold or doesn't it? And if it doesn't, you should use some other kind of modeling. Jay Forrester, who is the guru of system dynamics, the founder of the field, you will read a paper by him later in the term, makes the assertion that no human decision is ever made outside the context of a feedback loop. That is, every human decision is made by people looking at what's going on around them and reacting to it in order to change the system. I'm going to give you an opportunity to challenge that statement if you look at the first question on assignment number 0, and that is to help me find an exception. I would like to really give him one and say my environmental studies 25 class thought of 17 good examples of where you are wrong, and so please help me. I must say I haven't found one yet. But think about it. See if you can. Think of a human decision, any human decision that you know about, that is not made in that way, by looking either at the state of the system or at the state of the system compared to a goal, and then an action formulated in order to, let's say, bring the system closer to the goal. Okay? Think about that for next time. Okay. I've given you the two basic elements in a feedback system: the state of the system and then the change, the decision, the action to change it. System dynamicists have special names for the two kinds of elements. This one we call a level, and this one a rate. A level is what people look at to make decisions, and the rate is the decision itself. And we illustrate these in our not causal diagrams, but dynamo flow diagrams by making a box for the level and by making a valve for the rate. I call them milk cans. There are a lot of funny names for these. It's an engineering symbol. It came out of engineering, and it's meant to stand for a valve, for example, in a pipe that turns the water on and off. You screw that little thing in the top, and it turns the flow on and off. It's the regulator of a flow. And in fact, let me just illustrate precisely how we would designate the basic feedback loop in system dynamics dynamo notation. We would have a level called the state of the system, whatever that is. Flowing into that level or out of it would be the action or the change or the decision. Could go either direction. This is simply a regulator of whatever it is that's changing the state of the system. And then information about the state of the system is going into that action. Let me put this up so you can see it better. And if there's a goal of some sort, let's assume for the moment that it's a constant goal, although it needn't be, then that is also part of this decision function. Okay? The actual change, the thing flowing in or out of the level, is shown by a solid arrow. The information that goes into the decision is shown by a dashed set of dashed arrows. There may be a lot of other information. There may be other system states that go into the decision. Can get very complicated. And if you look again at the deer model example, you can see some more complicated examples. Let me show you for the little systems I've given you here, how we would make this into a level rate diagram. The level of beer is obviously a level. In this case, if we're only looking at the beer pouring and not the beer drinking part of the system, the flow goes in from the keg, which is the cloud in this case. If you're concerned about depletion effect on the keg, you would probably make a level here, which is level in keg. Okay, but for the moment, let's assume the keg is infinite. There's a beer flow rate, let's say, which is actually what's determined by the spigot setting. And that beer flow rate depends on how much beer is there and on the desired beer level. And let's say that's a constant. Okay? Now you could easily expand this system. You could have a drinking rate out this side. You could put the keg in, etc. You could put in a human capacity for holding beer there. You can go on and on. But this is how that basic feedback loop would be illustrated. The bank balance would be roughly the same way. This is money in the bank, which is a level state of the system. From the bank's infinite resources flows interest added. And the amount of that flow is determined by what is already in the bank and the interest rate, which is a constant. Now, I won't show you all of this system because it'll take a little long to illustrate, but it's sufficiently more complicated that we should at least begin. Let's make unproven reserves the level. And out of this flows in a part of the system we're not dealing with oil essentially into proven reserves, and out of that into extracted refined oil and so on. But we'll draw the boundary there for the moment. Fraction reserved remaining, we would illustrate this way with a circle. A circle means what we call an auxiliary. I always spell it wrong too. An auxiliary is really part of a rate equation. But in this case, we're wanting to spread the rate equation out into several steps. Okay? And so we'll illustrate a chain of these auxiliaries which will come back to a rate. Fraction reserves remaining. And this is a function also of the total reserves that were there in the first place. This is only necessary for calculation purposes. And then that tells us something about the cost of exploration, which is also an auxiliary. I'm pretty sure that this relationship is nonlinear. That while there's a lot of oil in the ground, probably the cost is going to be pretty low and constant, and it's only when you start really drawing the reserves down that the cost will increase. So I'm probably going to want to make a nonlinear function here, and I would show that on a dynamo diagram by putting two lines there. That means I'm going to make a table function of it, and I'll show you what a table function is next time when we talk about the dynamo language. But at this point, I'm reminding myself I want that to be a fairly complicated nonlinear relationship. And this is how it's shown on the diagram. the cost of exploration might go on to the price, which is another auxiliary. You could make that whole thing a string of auxiliaries. Going to the discovery rate is really this rate. So we'd have a string of auxiliaries coming around here, each of those elements. And as oil is discovered, it's moved out of the unproven reserve category into the proven reserve category. Okay? You can complete the diagram for yourself. You can even decide where there might be nonlinear relationships. Now you know all that you need to know to make a dynamo flow diagram except one symbol I haven't shown you yet, and that's a delay symbol. Let's assume that the cost of exploration doesn't result immediately in a higher price because you have to go through a government regulatory board or something like that. All right, so there's a price setting delay. In that case, I would show price as a delay of the cost, a delayed function of the cost of exploration. Price would be here. The delay symbol looks like that. And then the price could go on to influence revenues and so on. Let's make revenues another auxiliary, etc. You won't have to use delays in this course, but in the more advanced system dynamics courses, you spend a lot of time with them. Okay. I've given you a few exercises in assignment number 0 about causal diagramming, dynamo diagramming, and identifying levels and rates in systems. And we'll talk more about it next time. Look at the Deere model examples for more examples of how this works out. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I thought you were talking about state variables being how you monitor the system. Those are always levels.
State variables are levels, yes. And in every feedback loop, we would expect to find a state variable that influences the decision and is then influenced by the decision. So in every feedback loop, we would expect to find a rate and a level. Let me say, I'm giving you the fundamentalist rules. We break that rule a lot. But in general, that's the way we begin expecting to find the world. We may find it isn't that way, in which case we break the rule. It's more important to have the model represent the world correctly than it is to have the model follow the rules of the method correctly. Okay? And I'll show you some sneaky ways to break the rules later. First we start you pure, and then we tell you how to get impure. Yes? The solid arrow is a material flow of something into or out of a level. In that case, it's really an accounting flow of oil that you thought you had classified as unproven reserves, and they've gone into a proven reserve category. The next flow would actually be a physical flow of oil out of the proven reserves into a refinery. Okay? Now, last quick point, you will hear more about this in next week. The most important single thing I think about system dynamics is not feedback loops and it's not rates and levels, although those are all part of the whole scheme. The most important thing is that when we've come this far in analyzing a system, we gain a lot of knowledge about how a structure of interrelationships generates a dynamic behavior. I've already given you an indication of that today. For example, I said a positive feedback loop reinforces itself. Anytime I see a positive feedback loop in a system, I expect that it's going to behave over time like that, or like that, depending on whether it's reinforcing itself positively or negatively. That is, a positive feedback loop generates exponential growth or exponential decline. And that's a theorem which I can prove to you mathematically, but I won't do in this course. I hope to give you a sort of gut feeling for why that happens. And you'll see it happen in the Kaibab model, because the positive feedback loop of deer in births and deer in births generates the exponential growth in that system. Whenever I see a positive feedback loop, assuming it's not influenced by other things, all by itself, I expect exponential growth. That's how your bank balance will grow if you don't take any money out. Okay? A negative feedback loop over time will behave in a goal-seeking fashion. If the goal is 0, it will approach 0 exponentially. Let's say the goal of the system is here. This is the level of beer you would like in your glass. The system then will approach that level. If it's above the level, it'll approach it like that. A goal-seeking system, no matter what side of the desired level it's on, or the goal is on, will approach the goal, and that's a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback loops behave that way. Mathematically, we'll go into that a little more next time, and a lot more if you take any of the advanced courses in system dynamics. Now, it goes further than that. For example, a negative and a positive feedback loop hooked together. If there are no delays in it, I know, as a system dynamicist, can only behave like that. The positive loop runs this part, and the negative loop runs that part. If there's a delay, it can do that, or it can do a lot of other things. And things get very complicated as you start linking these things together. But as part of the essentially working knowledge of every system dynamicist are a bunch of theorems, axioms really, about how certain kinds of causal structures generate certain kinds of dynamic behaviors and vice versa. And this is extremely important because it gives the modeler a clue about how to go into the real world, observe a behavior, and make a model of it. It's not always a perfect clue because as systems get very complex, your intuitive understanding breaks down and you have to go to the computer to figure out what the dynamic behavior of a whole lot of linked feedback loops might be. But in general, if I see in the world somebody just comes to me and describes a problem as of something growing exponentially, I immediately ask myself, where is a positive feedback loop? Where is there some set of self-reinforcing causal factors? And if somebody describes to me a system that's really stagnant and they're trying to get it moving and it won't move, I look for a very strong negative feedback loop that's always pulling that system back to a goal, and so on. It's more complicated than that, and I won't be able to teach you all of these axioms in the short number of lectures that I have in this course. But I want you to get the idea that that's a set of mental tricks that provides a system dynamicist with a clue about how to model the world, about how, if his model is behaving wrong, to find where the mistakes might be, and so on. That is going always back and forth from structure to behavior and from behavior to structure. What the modeler tries to do is make an image in the computer of just those causal factors that are creating a real-world behavior that he wants to understand. And next time we'll get into the mathematics of this and how to translate statements about the system of this sort into a language that the computer can understand. Which one? That one?